In this video, we're going to discuss the appeal to anger as a fallacy in argumentation. So we're going to cover 8 things. We'll talk about what the appeal to anger is. We'll look at the argument structure of the fallacy. We'll talk about what makes this a bad argument, why it's actually a fallacy. Then we'll look at some common situations in which you can expect to see this arising. We'll talk about several examples of the fallacy. We'll talk about how to spot it. And then for the students who have to be able to distinguish this fallacy from other fallacies, we'll talk about what it often gets mistaken for and how not to misdiagnose this fallacy. We'll finish up by talking about how you can avoid falling into this fallacy in your own reasoning, argumentation, communication with others, and thinking about things. And I'll tell you a little story. I don't often do this at the beginning, but I'll tell you a little story about a really stupid thing that I did when I was a graduate student, and it was motivated by anger, and you could actually understand it as an example of this fallacy of appeal to anger. I had gone out one night and I left my bike locked away in the bike rack outside my office. I went into town to go to a party, and when I came back the next day to get my bike, the only thing that was left was the front wheel, because I'd locked it and somebody had actually come along with a wrench and taken the whole rest of the bike off. So I was furious, and I thought to myself, I'm going to get a new bike because I need to have a bike. I was living, a good ways from campus at that time. And I'm just going to get the cheapest thing available so nobody will steal it, or if they do, they're going to have the crappiest bike possible. You see what was kind of stupid about that? I talked myself into buying a bike that wasn't very well suited for me. It was a little bit too small, and it was very heavy and poorly put together, and that's what I did. But that's the sort of thing anger can get us to do. Let's talk about what this fallacy of anger is. And this one has a lot of different names, in part because we're not just thinking about the emotion of anger, we're also thinking about some closely allied emotions like spite or hate that you can appeal to as well, that work in more or less the same way. Sometimes this is called the argument from anger, or the argument from spite, the argument from hate, appeal to spite, argumentum ad iram, argumentum ad odium. I've even seen somebody call this the Rush Limbaugh fallacy because he makes such a practice out of trying to arouse anger in his audiences, and he's been doing that for quite some time. I don't know that we need to necessarily pick on Rush Limbaugh because I see people doing that on the left and the right and all over the place. What does the argument or appeal to anger consist in? So what it does is it tries to arouse or appeal to the pre-existing emotion of anger or something else like spite or bitterness or hatred in the audience, in the people that the claim is being made to, in order to get a claim accepted. So that's the sort of general overview of it. Now, oftentimes this is going to involve some kind of trigger or making an argument that the person who's supposed to accept the claim is being insulted or wronged or interfered with, and therefore should become angry. So this is what you can expect to see in it. And when we look at the structure of the fallacy, we see that there's something very funny going on with this. So the first premise, the one that's actually explicit, is I'm just going to call it Q. And Q could be anything we like. It could be, those bastards did this, or some people say that prisoners should get, but here's what prison conditions are really like, or that government, or those liberals, or those conservatives, or pick whatever you like. The doctor, the car cut me off. Cat lovers, dog lovers. Okay, so we have a premise, something that's supposed to make you angry. Somebody says something about something. Now, what's doing the work in this fallacy are actually the hidden premises. So one of these is if you're angry about Q or at Q, X is the case. If you don't have that, you can't get to the conclusion that X is the case. You just have something makes you angry and somebody makes a claim. Connecting those two things up together, that requires an implicit premise. Now, there's another implicit premise as well that is worth looking at, and it's that you have good reason to be angered by Q, whatever Q happens to be. Sometimes people will make an appeal to anger, and with people who are easily angered, it's easy to push their buttons, as we say, or trip their triggers, to use the language that I was using earlier. And they may not actually have good reason to be made angry or have old anger awakened by Q. If we graph out the structure of the fallacy, it's pretty simple. Almost all of these appeals to emotions are pretty simple in their structure, because that's really all that's going on. You're substituting somebody feeling an emotion for any sort of evidence or grounds, or you're using it to get them to accept evidence or grounds that they shouldn't accept. So person B does something to trigger person A's anger about some topic related to X. They remind them that somebody else was mean to them, or that, a product was bad. Who knows? Person A now feels the emotion of anger. They're the one who the fallacy is being made to. And because person A feels the emotion of anger, they'll now accept that claim X is true. And when we graph it out like this, you can see that this is a very bad argument. There's really no good grounds why they should accept it. Let's talk about now what's actually going on. Why is this a fallacy? What is the failure in reasoning or in critical thinking that's going on? So one thing we can say is that in general, how you feel about a claim, or the subject matter of the claim, or the person making it, or the person that's being discussed in it, or add whatever you want, none of that's actually relevant in most cases to the objective truth or falsity of the claim. There could be some cases where it is relevant, but in most cases, how you feel is not really an index for what is the case. A lot of people fall into this sort of substitution of feeling for reasoning or evidence or inference or even thinking things out. So like I said here, it substitutes having, arousing, or experiencing an emotion for having good grounds. Now, often anger can be provoked by things that shouldn't provoke us. If we were a bit less stressed, if we had our wits about us, if we were paying closer attention to what's going on, perhaps some of the things that make us angry, perhaps some of the things that people say to deliberately get us in an angry state so they can manipulate us, perhaps we wouldn't get angry in those cases. So anger can be provoked by insufficient grounds. It can also be transferred to other objects. A master manipulator is good at taking the anger that you feel about this and putting it over here. Or it can, come in time to be wrongly associated with events, with people, with institutions, with settings that it really doesn't have an intrinsic connection with. Another thing to keep in mind, oftentimes the intensity or the extent of the emotion, which could in fact be appropriate in a lesser degree in some cases, will be disproportionate. So these are the things that make it a bad kind of argumentation. Let's look at some common situations now. So when are you going to see this kind of appeal occurring? Well, usually there's going to be some sort of triggers in place, fault lines, you could say. There's already a history of disagreement or exploitation or unfairness or conflict, and people don't agree about what's actually taken place. There's rival narratives, and people have bad or hurt feelings that have been lingering for a while. It's very easy to find people doing appeals to anger in those sorts of situations. So what would be some frequent contexts? Opinion and information media. And when I say opinion media, I'm meaning people writing essays in everything from, the now looks like going under New Republic to Jezebel to Slate to pick whatever you like. Those are journals where people are writing stuff in part to make claims, but quite often to rile people up. Even information media, juicy stories, get people's attention, and you can start drawing inferences from them. And sometimes the news reporters or anchors or writers will do that. Politics and policy making. Anger is very frequently used as a motivating force for politics and policy making, oftentimes on both sides, but about different issues. Sometimes you can take the same issue and people can find ways where this group can be angry about this part of it and this group can be angry about this part of it, and they can both make claims against each other. Situations in which fairness or proportion is an issue. Dealing with roommates is a great example. Whether they're college roommates or, you're just working or people you have to live with, your family members. When you get to things like housework and who's paying for what and who's going to walk the dog or, what you're going to watch on TV, people can get quite upset about that sort of stuff. Workplaces, a very common situation in which appeals to anger can get made, sometimes by somebody saying, I'm going to show them, which means they're making an appeal to anger to themselves, like I did with the bike. Business arrangements. Advertising and marketing quite often makes appeals to anger, particularly when they're trying to contrast products and they're saying, hey, you should be angry at Comcast because of the way that they're screwing you. Buy our product instead. Social media is a particularly interesting case. Everything in Facebook, Twitter, Google+, a little bit less so with LinkedIn because people want to, stay professional with that sort of thing. But a lot of these social networks, people will post something that we call essentially clickbait, and it's to get other people riled up and get them to accept something. Oftentimes it's done with memes, so that's something to keep an eye on as well. Let's look at some examples now. So this is a favorite example of mine. I used to teach in prisons, and I know quite a bit about prison conditions as a result. And I would get this all the time from people. They would say, you got to be kidding me. Those guys in lockup get 3 square meals a day at our expense. They get free health care. They don't pay rent. They even get to have TVs in their cells. These are criminals you're talking about. Murderers, rapists, drug pushers, kidnappers. If anything, we should make prison less comfortable for them. And the conclusion is we shouldn't do anything to improve prison conditions. So why are you even talking about this sort of thing? Sometimes, you don't even have to make the claim that we should do anything to improve prison conditions. You just describe, this is what it's like for my guys. Their food isn't very good. People get very upset about that sort of thing. Now, you could look at these factual claims, these premises in here, and see that they probably require some interpretation. 3 square meals a day, pretty iffy. If you know much about the prison food system, not the best food. If they want to get their own food, they often pay 3 to 4 times what a person on the outside pays for the same food through the commissary. And when you're only earning, 20, 25, 35 cents an hour, your ramen costs you a lot of hours of work. TVs are a particularly interesting one. This is something that people get very upset about. It's an easy trigger that you can push. A small black and white TV can cost a prisoner up to $250 in prison. And one reason why you're going to find prison officials love the fact that prisoners have TVs is if they're in their cell watching TV, they're not doing something else. They're quiet. You know where they are. And it also gives you something you can take away from them. So it's a way to have power over them, in case they misbehave. So all of this sort of stuff, is that relevant to whether we should do anything to improve prison conditions? No, there's a failure of relevance here. Let's look at the next example. This is an interesting kind of thing, and I'm sure this happens all the time, and we could change the words around a little bit and make it fit a million different situations. I knew I shouldn't have trusted you with my car. Look at it. You've got food wrappers all over the place. The carpets are filthy, just like the apartment unless I clean it. You're such a jerk. You can't keep anything clean. Conclusion, I should never trust you with anything important to me. Now here's a case where a person is making an appeal to anger and they are functioning both as the audience and as the person making the argument. They're sort of reasoning with themselves and then they're just sort of throwing it at this other person and saying, I'm not going to trust you with anything. That's the conclusion here. Is somebody turning in a car, messy once a reason not to trust them with anything? That's a little out of proportion. Even, a roommate who's messy half the time they're not messy, right? And we could explore this a little bit further, but I don't want to get too bogged down in this example. Let's look at the third one. Now, this is very common, and this would be one which is happening in a workplace. And imagine a meeting is taking place and one person is saying to the rest of the people, we have to do something about this. I can't believe they let the contract bid go to that other company. It's clear they think we're a bunch of suckers, a bunch of chumps that just have to take whatever they feel like doling out to us. Fine, we'll show them. Conclusion, we should cut off their supplies of our product. And this is one of those, cut off your nose to spite your face kind of thing, because if you're making business decisions based on anger, you're probably going to have a hard time, doing good business and remaining in business for very long. There's a reason why people will say this isn't personal, just business. It's not a very prudent thing to do, but this sort of thing does happen. A lot of people will say, fine, you're not going to treat me the way that I want to be treated. I'm going to retaliate in some way. And in this case, it's being said we should retaliate, not just I'm going to retaliate. We as a policy ought to retaliate. This could be a company. This could be a book club. This could be a nation. But it's the same basic idea. Let's look now about how we might spot this fallacy of appeal to anger. What are the things that you want to look out for? First, you want to pay attention to inflammatory language, unfair or one-sided characterizations, or references to past, present, or future wrongs. And I put perceived wrongs here in parentheses because they don't actually have to be real wrongs. As a matter of fact, you don't even have to have, true propositions, facts. You can make stuff up. People do this. A lot of times wrongs are imaginary, or they are the product of faulty memory. But pay attention when people are talking about this sort of thing. And ask, are these intended to have an effect on the audience? Are they intended to affect the emotions of the audience, to arouse emotions, to direct their emotions going this way or this way, saying, well, you should be mad, and that's the guy you should be mad at, and because of that, you should do this over here. Another thing, are the emotions of the audience being used to get them to accept or reject claims, or to weigh evidence or reasoning differently than they would? That's something to pay attention to. And in group situations where somebody's making an appeal to you, look around and pay attention to the audience, the other members of your group, to see whether they're being affected by the emotional appeal and manipulation, or whether they're not. For students, one of the things we want to be able to do is distinguish this fallacy from other fallacies. And one of the ones that's easy to confuse us with is the argument from outrage, because the argument from outrage does involve some sort of anger response. Now, the argument from outrage involves one person making an argument to another person, and the first person is appealing to their anger. They're feeling insulted or offended, and they're saying, because I feel this way, you should accept this claim. So that's different than the appeal to anger, where you're saying, look, you feel this way, so you should accept this claim. Or you're saying it to yourself, hey, Greg, you accept this claim because you're angry at XYZ. So the argument from outrage is something different. Arguments that say bad things about another person in order to get their claim dismissed or disregarded are some version of ad hominem. There's a number of different versions, and we'll talk about that in other videos. So, if somebody's bad-mouthing, trash-talking another person, it could be because they want to get you angry at them, or it could be because they just want you to dismiss their claims. Name-calling ad hominem is probably the closest to the appeal to anger. Now, another one that's kind of connected is scapegoating. When one person is being blamed for other people's faults or for everything being bad, that's scapegoating. It could be easy to confuse it with appeal to anger because oftentimes the scapegoats are people that we tend to get angry with or hate or enjoy seeing hurt or something like that. But what's the difference there? In scapegoating, you're actually saying, look, here's the reason why things are so messed up. It's that person over there. You're concluding by saying that's the bad apple. That's the one who's screwed things up. There's two other things I want to say. It's possible for an audience to be or get angry without turning an argument into a fallacious argument. So just because somebody is actually expressing anger or just because the audience is angry, that doesn't mean that you can identify a fallacy of appeal to anger. In order for there to be a fallacy of appeal to anger, anger has to be used as the grounds for why they should accept the claim. Now, if the conclusion of the argument is that the audience ought to be or get angry, that's not necessarily a fallacious argument. Now, notice what I said, the conclusion. In the fallacy of appeal to anger, anger works as a premise. It works as one of the things that you accept in order to get to the conclusion. The conclusion is that a claim should be accepted. But if you're making an argument that, look, buddy, you ought to be angry about this sort of thing because, look at how they're treating you, that's not an appeal to anger. That's an argument in which anger has some sort of place, but it's not an appeal to anger. Now, how do you avoid falling into this fallacy yourself? There's a couple little guide points, that you can reference. One would be, however tempting, and it can often be extremely tempting because it's sort of like plucking low-hanging fruit, don't appeal to your audience's emotional state in place of providing solid evidence or argumentation. This really goes for all of the appeals to the emotions. If you're going to be a critical thinker and you're treating your audience as if they're critical thinkers, you're not, trying to manipulate them, then even if you can push their buttons, you probably shouldn't do so. Because once you start getting into that habit, it becomes very easy to just keep doing it over and over again. Now, also realize that a claim that an audience accepts in an emotional state might not be retained. It might be rejected by them when they're no longer in that state. So you should remind yourself that if I get them to accept this claim because they feel a certain way, this is not going to be a lasting solution. And then see, as always, if you can make a case for your claim to the audience without engaging in a fallacy, without the aid of the emotion. Or at the very least, if you're going to deal with anger, try to keep it in proportion. Try not to let it spill over into all sorts of other things that are unrelated, but seem to be, at the time, perhaps connected. One of the things that anger often does to us, even those who might be making the appeal, is it tends to make us connect things that aren't actually connected together and overlook things that we should pay attention to. So it makes us uncritical thinkers. The last thing that I want to say is that this video is part of a series on fallacies. So it belongs to an entire critical thinking and logic and argumentation channel that you can expect to see more and more videos being uploaded to. So if you like this video or you found it useful, and if you think that there's other people that would enjoy it as well, share it with those people and come back to this channel because, like I said, I'm going to be uploading more and more and more, not only in this series, but all sorts of other topics dealing with critical thinking and argument and logic.